back to give us an update on what's happened in terms of his program development in the last 12 months. Jeff is well known to all of us, but just if you haven't met him, he manages the API's aftermarket order programs for diesel exhaust fluid, for the diesel exhaust fluid certification program, and also the engine oil licensing certification system. He'll tell you more about what that is, but it's a really crucial program which supports management of quality across the country for DEF. He's going to give us an update on API, tell us how the order program's running, and some of the results that have come up from that work. So, Jeff, welcome to the stage. Good to have you back.
Thank you very much for having me. I always appreciate being here. According to my watch, my presentation ended 9 minutes ago. So
we'll give you some more time.
That's right. I'll try to be brief. I know a lot of what I present is a bit redundant when I talk about the programs, but I do have some pretty useful information, some interesting updates to what we're seeing based off the data that we've received, and also some goings on in the the specification that I think has some direct effect to a lot of folks in the room. So we'll just get straight into it. Of course, our diesel exhaust licensing, fluid licensing program, primary goal is to make sure that there's a API certified DEF that meets the industry standards and established performance requirements, gets into the hands of the consumers. We do this by certifying brands of DEF and licensing the use of the API quality marks on those products. And then we follow that up with a pretty robust monitoring of the DEF licensed products out in the marketplace. As you all know, the DEF performance requirements are based on the ISO 22241 standard, which is undergoing a bit of a change. There's also the Marine DEF standard 18611. I'll get into some of the changes that affect the AUS 32 or the automotive grade DEF here shortly, but for our part, our program's based on parts 1, 2, and 3, which are the quality requirements, the test methods, and then the handling, transportation, and storage. Essentially, this spec will address the product quality from plant to pump. So these are our marks here. This is our website here where interested applicants can go in and take a look at what the program requirements are. I'll touch on them briefly here shortly. And this presentation obviously will be made available on the Integer website, so if I blow through something, feel free to ask me after the talk or have a look at the presentation later on. So very briefly, our program is based on an application and renewal sort of cycle. During the application, we're going to be asking for supply points where the product will be manufactured. We've got some work to do in that area, as I'll outline in a later slide, but we're also asking for the typical values of the chemistry of each of the products to be licensed. We have our applicants submit certificates of analyses that demonstrate that the product has been analyzed and meets the spec tolerances, and then also require traceability coding on those formats that can accept it, and then enter a license agreement with the applicants. Our annual renewal process also involves the submitting of COAs to demonstrate that the intent of parts 3 of the specification, which has requirements for testing of batches before releasing products into the marketplace, are met. So in a nutshell, that's the application. I'll skip through this slide, but one of the benefits of getting an API license is that there are OEMs that are out there that are actually specifying or recommending API licensed DEF in their equipment. Here's an example from the heavy-duty sector from PACCAR for their KW emissions system, and then I've got a little bit highlighted there in yellow. On the light-duty side, it gets a little more black and white. There, to maintain a warranty on that, you're only to use DEF that's licensed by the American Petroleum Institute in order to maintain your models. For all those models, to maintain your warranty for those models there. And then as we move into the NRMM sector, and thanks to Case, Chris' company, we've got some examples of what their requirements are here. So the API mark is out there. It is being specified or recommended by OEMs. We're glad. We'd like to see that more often, of course. But there's one of the one of the main drivers for pursuing a license. Very quickly, our program at a glance, this program came together and was modeled after our engine oil licensing program, which has many years under its belt. The first license, they asked us to put together a program that was similar to that, and we responded, and our first license was issued back in March of 2009. So we're rapidly approaching a 10-year anniversary on our program here. To date, and this is a number that fluctuates often, it's nice that the conference is always at around the same time each year, because I can give you kind of a look at where things are at. Right now we have 89 licensed DEF marketers, and that's an increase from this time last year of about 7%. You can see the spread there about where these are located. Obviously, we're primarily here in North America, with more coming on in areas of Mexico and in South America as well. For those 89 licensees, they've licensed about 165 different products, individual brand names that they market to their customers. This is about twice as much of a jump, so we can see some rapid diversity in how folks are marketing and managing their product lines and licensing from the licensing perspective at any rate. And then, back probably now 4 or 5 years ago, we introduced the marine diesel exhaust fluid licensing program that's built off the AUS 40 specification. As you can imagine, that's much slower to develop, but we do have 7 licensed AUS 40 brands out there. And the way our program works for that, our licensees can add that product, add those brands to their license without applying for a new license. It's just another brand that they tack onto their license. We do back this up with an audit. Our licensees are required to submit product. They don't submit products to us. Rather, we have an aftermarket audit program where we're out there purchasing their products in the marketplace. Our goal is to test as many API licensed products as possible from the broadest geographic area that we can. Certainly with most of our licensees here in the States, you can imagine we spend a lot of time here in the States doing our collection. But we are ever expanding and trying to ever expand into different markets as well. Our packaged and bulk samples, we do this annually. It kicks off right around the end of the first quarter of each year, and it ends in March of each year. So we are right in the middle of our current 2018 sampling cycle right now. We will purchase samples from consumer points at random. So we are out hitting the truck stops. We are out hitting the retail shelves. We are out hitting as many different formats as we possibly can, and at random. While we are out sampling bulk, for instance, there are times where we need to review bulk shipment paperwork. That's one of the challenges in this business, is trying to identify, yes, we got a sample from so-and-so, but where did so-and-so get that sample from? And, sometimes we have to review the bulk shipment paperwork while we're there. We blind code these samples once they get returned to a central collection lab, and then ship them out to a separate testing lab, so they have no idea what they're testing. They only know who they're testing. They only know what they're testing. And throughout this process, we maintain a pretty strict chain of custody so that we can use this information later if we have issues. Really quickly, scope of the audit testing. It is the entirety of the ISO 22241 specification. A few things are dropping out of that, and I will get into an update on where the ISO specs are at this point, but as far as what we're testing, we've dropped the density testing out of it, and we've dropped the identity testing out, but everything else in there is what we will run and report on with each of our audits. How we evaluate these audits, obviously we're looking to see if the product meets the specifications, but we are bound to expand the limits of that specification based on the reproducibility or the ability of laboratories to repeat measurements. When we do have a non-conforming product, we always have it retested at the primary laboratory so we can assure that it's a non-conformance. And then we go a step further and have that product tested at a secondary lab in a completely different location to confirm those test results so that we can be absolutely rock solid on the fact that we've got a non-complying product before we send it out to the marketer to let them know that there's an issue and work with them. All of these results are then technically reviewed by an independent consultant and assessed for their conformance. And at that point, those reports come over to us, and the data that we get from our collection company allows us to then go one step further and examine the packaging for the packaged products or any use for accurate use of the API registered trademark. There's some rules behind the sizing and the placement and things of that nature. So we'll do those sorts of audits as well. Then we go ahead and report this out to the licensee or the marketers. If a retailer, for instance, like a truck stop or something like that, is very interested in finding out how the product is that we sampled and tested, at this point, if they request, we'll follow up with them and let them know basically on a pass-fail basis with limited information about what the test results were, but what properties perhaps failed. We'll let them know that that's the case. We do place confidentiality. The emphasis is confidential test results. We only share the exact test results with the marketers themselves. And then if we do get to a point where we have non-compliances, we take enforcement action through a myriad of ways, but obviously starting with corrective action to API satisfaction. We are trying to protect the integrity of our program. We're trying to protect the integrity of the mark so that it means something to the consumers out there, so that it means something to the licensees. And so we will work with the licensees to ensure that any issues have been resolved. If they don't want to listen, or if there's some issues, there's always the opportunity to cancel a product from a license, or perhaps out and out cancel a license and withdraw their ability to use the API marks and market their products as API licensed. Fortunately, that's not anything we've had to encounter yet. So we also will, if in certain instances, most instances actually, ask for a recall of the product. If it's possible to recall of a product, and for assurances that that's done. And then in the greatest cases, we would pursue legal action if necessary, if we couldn't resolve it through any of the previous methods. So just based on past experience, our audits are resulting in systems improvements on the manufacturing side of things. I've had worked with marketers who have replaced their raw materials. They've had to install new DI systems or new types of DI systems in order to achieve compliance. Replaced, in cases they've found defective sensors, filters that needed to be replaced. And then in certain cases, they've had to restructure their manufacturing to where they didn't have a dedicated fill line or a dedicated transfer line, and they reconfigured their operations in order to fully dedicate themselves to DEF. So all these are positive changes, we feel, and have gone a long way to help those marketers, erase those issues going forward. You get a lot of things on the QA/QC side. Rinsing procedures are improved for tanks, filling equipment, increased testing frequencies, independent laboratory analysis. So they're sending their samples out. They're making sure that they're collecting more retains, increasing the frequency of the retention time or the amount of retention time so that they can go back and investigate problems. And then some folks have even added auto sampling equipment to their production lines. So, and then obviously rigorous employee training is one of those things. And additional things that they do and that we all try to do, I'm sure, is educate the customers, the end users, in order to make sure that they are, transporting, handling, and storing these products with the right material, with the right materials, with the right environmental conditions in mind, and then also educating them on shelf life considerations. And I have a little anecdotal sort of story to tell you about that just shortly here. But for the last 3 cycles, this is the sample distribution. I think it was last year, this same map. We had a hole in Arkansas. Well, we filled that hole, but the hole moved over to Kentucky. You can see that a lot of the deep red here certainly corresponds with some of the graphs that we saw in terms of where the new truck stops and such are coming online. Following the trucking corridor, you'll see here on the next slide the types of areas that we get our samples. We are ever increasing the number of samples that we take and test every year. So, my goal is to see a lot more deep red next year, and no gray. But as we, as I alluded to before, these are the types of places where we're mainly getting our samples, at least based on the 2017 audit cycle. Now, the 2017 audit cycle, we roughly, we more than doubled the amount of samples that we've taken. And in the case of bulk samples, the lion's share of the bulk samples that we obtained are coming from the truck stop travel center, where the lion's share of the bulk DEF is being sold. And then the smaller slices of the pie there are broken out for you. But after that, it would be fueling stations and repair shops, garage, etc. On the packaged side of things, you'll see dealerships come into play there. They tend to sell more of a format of their own branded DEFs, so there's a lot more accessibility to package samples there. But most of where we get our package samples, as you can imagine, are the retail stores, the convenience stores, the stores adjacent to the truck stops, etc. Our goal as we move forward, and sorry, this presentation has had these, I put these in years ago and I still haven't removed them all. It likes to skip over on its own. It's got a mind of its own. But we are going to be adding greater slices of the pie to the manufacturers and to the distributors here shortly, and I'll talk about that as well. To give you a quick summary of where we were on 2017, most of our samples were collected here in the U.S. and Canada. We did do some random international sampling, but not really enough to show any trends or do any sort of circumspect, comprehensive analysis. We did do nearly 700 samples in the past year. We're trying to flip the ratio of bulk to package so that we hit that sweet spot of the format that is being collected. But as I mentioned before, we're mainly sampling our licensees' products, and there are some pretty big players in the bulk market that are not API licensed, so we have to try to avoid them. We don't avoid them. We do the sampling and testing of that as well, but we are trying to grow the bulk product side of the sampling as best we can. Mainly, all these categories out of the bulk, the packaged products, we've exceeded the previous 3 cycles combined. So we've really started to double and redouble our efforts in the collection and testing business, as you guys have voiced to me over the years. The good news here is, if it's good news, we've ticked up with the conformance rate. I mean, the glass is half full here. Last year I reported that we were at around the 94% level with what we saw. Here we're up to about an overall conformance rate of 95%, and that's with over more than doubling the sample size. So that's a good trend. I've got more trends here to show you, but in general, last year I presented this. The light gray bars represent 2017. Based on what I showed you last year, but last year we had a trend, at least in the data that we saw, that the bulk was outperforming the packaged. In other words, these are the conformance rates. The bulk, the trend line was going up. On the package side, it was going down. It does appear to be normalizing itself here based on the 2017 data, and I went forward and looked at the 2018 data. We've got about 400 or 500 samples analyzed and looked at by now. And I'm happy to say that there's not an awful, I don't believe there's any non-compliances at this point, but the testing, retesting, and referee testing kind of slow the process down, so those tend to come in towards the end of the sampling cycle. So the news here is that, overall we're at about 95% conformance. Of course, there are issues I'll get into, and these are the issues that we're starting to see. So this is just a summary over the last 3 years of the quality characteristics ranked from the most frequent to the least frequent issues, and then I've got them totaled there on the right-hand side. Last year I reported to everybody that we were having water quality issues, and that trend certainly seems to continue. Maybe not so much on the rise, but it definitely exists. The lion's share of the findings that we have when we mark an audit as non-conforming has to do with either sodium or calcium, which we classify as water quality issues. And then, as you can see there, in 2017, handfuls of alkalinity issues, and moving on down the line, just some random properties here, random properties there. So we're fortunate that most of the properties are being adhered to, but it does appear that there's been some struggle with maintaining the quality of the water that goes into the products. It's important to note that those 2017 are to date. We still have a handful of audits out there for a final retesting with wild numbers. So I'm looking in to see whether those are valid or not, but we're looking at about 5 or 6 audits there that haven't quite been wrapped up. It's also important to note that these are not individual failing samples. A single sample could have more than one failure, which is pretty common. When you see high sodium, it's often coupled with a high calcium, for instance. So I took a deeper look at the water purity issue this time around. On the left-hand side is just the frequency of what we deem water quality failures. So that's limited to we limit that basically to calcium, magnesium, and sodium levels. And as you can see, the sodium issue, where it sort of spiked in 2016, is sitting there at 4% and definitely represents the highest rate of nonconformance out of the 3 properties. So I wanted to go a little further, and I went into the database of all of our reported measurements, and I wasn't very scientific in this. I took the first measurement that the lab gave me for each one of the 700 samples, and I just wanted to kind of cluster it because when you get a result from a lab, you have this non-detect level that's below what their equipment can actually report out to, and then you have a gap between that and the actual specification limit, and then of course the non-conforming limits above that, or the non-conformances above that. And what I found out was the rate of non-detect reported results is far higher for obviously for calcium and sodium. So in other words, I'm getting a measured amount of concentration from my laboratories for calcium and for sodium. Sorry, that keeps doing that. And you can see the difference between magnesium there up at around the 96, 97% level. Magnesium's not really an issue, but we are getting measured amounts at 1 in every 5 samples of the sodium and of the calcium, and then they're tough for me to explain away 2015. We had a lot of failures that year, but the trend is still there where we're seeing measurable amounts of sodium and calcium in our system. So this, I bring these up just to show you that there's, kind of fortify the idea that there's still some issues with water purity that aren't seeming to go away. So the bad news is water purity is about to get a little worse, and this is because the ISO specification has been updated in terms of reproducibility. There was a study done during the last cycle. The European laboratories took it upon themselves as they were adding a phosphate test, allowing phosphate to be measured by ICP as opposed to the conventional Annex H method. So they redid a round robin for that, and of course, as you're running an ICP on that, why not recalculate all the precision statements for all the other elements? And those things have tightened up very considerably. So what this graph basically shows you, I took my 2017 data and the conformance rate for sodium, and I just picked sodium for example because it showed the best sort of trend, versus the specification alone. That's not considering reproducibility at all. We had it should say non-conformance. We had a 6% non-conformance rate. Sorry for the error there. When you throw in reproducibility on that, it was about, that knocks it down to the number of failing samples being 4%. In 2019, the reproducibility is such that it basically has no effect on adjusting the specification limit for sodium. And I've got a nice slide here that I want to show you guys coming up that shows what the effects of the proposed 2019-ish version of the standard is going to do to the test limits that people like me pass and fail audits on, but also people like Amalgatech and people like Tony over there are going to be reporting perhaps pass and fails on their tests. So I thought it was very important to bring that to your guys' attention. So it's important to note that the ISO specification is not finalized. It's not going to be published. They're in a phase right now known in the ISO world as FDIS. It's the final draft standard, I believe, is what that stands for. At this point, the nation states that are members of the body are going to vote to approve or disapprove or have comment. Once that ballot is created, there's about a 2-month period for commentary and for people to submit their ballots. And then at that point, the standard is at the behest of however quickly ISO can get those two standards out to publication, get the standard out to publication. So what we're looking at here is basically in column, there's the spec limits in the first column. There's those limits adjusted for reproducibility with the 2006, and then I've got and bear in mind, maybe an issue comes up and this doesn't pass, but if everything goes the way that I think it is, these are going to be the new limits that API is going to be assessing conformance on. And the thing to look at is the effect on what those ranges are, and that's the last column there. And the ones that are in red are the ones that are probably going to affect you guys the most. Very quickly, as I said, with the ICP and all those elements down at the bottom, that's based on a new round robin. But all of the older sort of tests, the Annex B, D, E, F, G, and H, they went back and looked and reanalyzed the original test data in accordance with the ISO 4269. So they took the original data that everybody used when they published the first set of standards and looked at them with a more modern specification. And what that has done, and there's some issues with it, the right number of degrees of freedom weren't met on those particular annexes, but it has improved or changed the reproducibility on those. So in summary, the big ones on here, you'll note we have a new Annex C method of urea concentration determination through the benchtop refractometer. They did a round robin here in the States based on that. It is a far more reproducible test specification. So you're going to see what is a divergence for those people that are running it versus the total nitrogen method. The spec limits are actually going to get a little wider there, whereas for those people that are testing it using the refractometer, look at those spec limits there. Where the spec limits is 31.8 to 33.2, with the reproducibility, we're down to 31.6 to 33.4. So that 1% that was published in the old standard is going to be going away. So there are tighter limits that we'll be assessing our conformance to, and I suspect the industry will as well. Those also play out in the refractive index, etc. The other big ones are, of course, the calciums down through potassiums. You'll see there in the left-hand column those spec limits, and the far right-hand column with the new reproducibility limits. Effectively, there is no reproducibility being added to it unless you get down to potassium. So as it is, what you see is what you get with the spec. So that's why I'm able to confidently say we might have more issues with water quality going forward, because no longer am I assessing sodium against a spec limit of 0.75. Now I'm failing anything above 0.5 cut and dry. So I do suspect that we'll see in 2018, if I'm asked to report again next year, we may see this propagate out into some issues on some of the graphs that I've shown. Really quickly, we obviously have to handle violations of the use of the mark quite a bit. So we take any infringement cases very seriously. Normally, we'll issue a list of demands that includes label changes, destruction of existing labels, immediate product recall, posting of public notices to consumers on the websites and company materials, and then any failure to meet these demands and resolve to API satisfaction is going to result in getting the lawyers involved. So I do have some snapshots of some recent violations, and on the engine oil side, this is a lot more fun because I get to put up the slide of one that we found recently. Somebody marketing a quart of engine oil that is both an ATF and a current category engine oil, one lubricant fits all application, which is impossible. I don't have any great examples of that on DEF. It's pretty cut and dry. You're either using the marks and have a right to do so, or you don't. So in the last couple of years, we've had 7 recent cases. In 7 cases, we were able to go out and buy and purchase samples of that and test it. The remaining case was based solely on the use of the mark on company websites, because we're out there. We have folks that will contact us quite a bit and let us know that there's an issue, or, hey, is this licensed? We found this here. You know, and if those things come across my desk, generally I'll start to get the collection companies involved and send somebody out to get it. We send our demand letters out with the aforementioned demands to all of the offending marketers, and I'm happy to report that the demands were met in every one of these cases. 3 of these marketers obtained a license or got a license somehow through one of our other licensed marketers, had their brand added to somebody's license, and the remaining marketers cease and desisted. So we're out there trying to make sure that, again, the integrity of the marks is being preserved. We are also, after we resolve one of these cases, certainly we're doing routine checks to make sure that further misuse is not occurring. So for the future of AMAP, the audits are underway for the 2018 cycle. We're at about 450 samples collected to date. Remember, we're in the middle of our cycle. Our cycle is going to end at the end of March. The collection period goes up to March 2019. This is the, we've been getting some commentaries from some of our licensees about the importance of plant sampling. So we are hoping to add blend plant sampling to the scope of our collectors. There's a lot of weeds to work through on this. I've spent the summer, graciously accepting invites to go visit various blend plants, and then taking my own samples, seeing the blending facilities, so that I can educate my collection network. So in October, and in fact it's going to be it's going to be when I get back, I wanted to see if there was any feedback from this group first. API is going to canvass our licensees to disclose all of their blend plant locations, and then we'll strive to sample each of these plants routinely, if we're permitted to do so. Random, unannounced access is obviously going to be desired. Sorry about that. I'll put that back up. And that's preferred by us simply because we want to be there. We don't, we say this on the lube side, we want to make sure that we're there and that they're not switching over to the good stuff sort of thing when we show up. It's desired, but obviously, we understand that these are plants. Sometimes they're staffed, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're operational, sometimes they're not. So, obviously, we are going to try our best to work with the marketers. One of the ideas around that is, while we're there, maybe we grab a sample off the fill line, but at the same time, if they're willing to relinquish a few of their retained samples that they're holding, we'll sample and test those as well. Idea behind this, of course, being to make sure that we get into as many plants as possible. We've got a myriad of different licensees. In a lot of cases, those licensees may just be bulk suppliers, and we're not getting to their customers. So we want to make sure that we're representing and getting access to their products in any way that we can. So, for those marketers that are in the room that manage the license or make decisions, you'll probably be seeing something from me as early as next week, asking for this blend plan information. And we do track this loosely with the licensing program as part of an initial application, but the way our program, online licensing program, is designed, we don't have a good mechanism for encouraging the licensees to go in there and continually update that. So we're going to be, talking with IT going forward, if this is a success, in order to make it easier for our licensees to keep track of their blend plant operations within the API system. On the ISO update, we talked about this already, but like I said, we are looking for a timeline to publications perhaps at the end of the year. I doubt that it will come out any sooner for parts 1 and 2. before first quarter of 2019, just based on the ISO process. Some of the other things that are going to be coming down the pike there with Part 1 and Part 2, Annex C is being completely revamped. That's the urea content refractive index. Basically, that was revamped to kind of get away from the generation and calibration curves and using certified reference materials in order to conduct the testing. Annex I was updated to include the phosphate determination by the measurement of potassium in the ICP test, and so that fostered the new precision study that was completed, and that it's affecting all of our acceptance ranges here in the future. And again, density and Annex J are no longer part of the core quality characteristics. So we have stopped we've stopped testing for that. Part 3 is already out. It was published at the tail end of 2017. There are updates there as well. So I'd encourage you, if you don't already have it, to get it. And then parts 4 and 5, which deal with dispensers. They're going to be released along with parts 1 and part 2. They're following the same path. So I talked about this last year. These slides are not new. You had them last year as well, but just a reminder that DEF was added to the National Conference Weights and Measures Handbook 130. So there are requirements for labeling, and there are requirements for basically all aspects of getting the product from the plants to the distributors to the end, to the installers, and then even from the installers to the customers. And that's all based solely around adequately reporting what those consumers are buying, right down to the brand name. So the regulations are in place to help the regulators and the weights and measures inspectors understand what DEF is, but what they adopted mandates that the manufacturer and brand name be reported all the way down the chain of custody, all the way to the end point where it's coming out on the receipt at the pumps. Retailers may be asked. I don't get a lot of information on this from weights and measures that they're actually doing this yet, but they certainly have the law in place to be able to ask retailers to produce this information during one of their routine W&M visits. So it also affects packagers. There's package label requirement, essentially right there, that it conforms to ISO 22241, and that there's storage recommendations. So that statement in quotations must appear on packages. And I'll show you a map here of what states have adopted this. But again, it also impacts the retailers too. So there's a requirement for dispensers to be labeled with the quoted marks there as well on the front panel. So for those of you folks that are in that sort of game, we'd encourage you or yours to check with your state regulators and your state inspectors to find out what exactly your customers and you yourself need to do to be in compliance with Handbook 130 and to avoid any issues with the weights and measures. So the regulations are in place for half the USA. Today there are 25 states. Forget this list. There's a map here on the next page. But there are a handful of states that adopt Handbook 130 in parts, or perhaps not. So there's about 25 unknowns. But we do expect other states to adopt. And so here's the map here. So those states in red automatically adopt the National Conference Handbook 130. So those once the National Conference puts it in the book, these guys are automatically have a new state law for their weights and measures inspectors to follow. The ones that are proposed, we know that they were proposing to adopt this regulation, but we've not gotten final confirmation from them. And then there are other states that are also listed as automatic adopters, but because we interact very little with the weights and measures inspectors there, we're not sure if they're checking for it. But hopefully this is helpful information to some folks who haven't seen it before. And as part of, we have a promotional effort that sort of is under development. It's a little bit on pause right now while Creative Services deals with some larger issues that we have going on at API, but we were going to provide our licensed marketers with dispenser labels that kind of met these requirements in the Handbook 130. These labels will allow the dispenser to display the certification mark. That's one place you don't see it very often, is at the dispenser level. You see it on packages, you know, over there in the corner and everything all over the place, but you know, it hasn't really permeated into the bulk sector. So we're going to incorporate a QR code on that. Sorry, that skipped through pretty quickly. So that consumers can, you know, just use their phones and go right to the directory of licensees to make sure that what they're getting is a licensed product. And then it'll be designed to mention those Handbook 130 requirements. So here's just a concept of what that is going to look like. And what we were planning on doing the last time we talked about this was providing this sort of file so that our marketers could take and produce those stickers. You'll see there that that statement for use in operating converters with SCR, that's right out of the handbook, so that's on there as well, and what have you. So other industry groups, right now, you know, D1525 on diesel exhaust fluids is actually meeting in DC in October. It's a few blocks down, so I get to walk to this thing instead of fly to it for a change, but it is an open committee with the goal of developing any standards that the current specs don't address. Not a lot going on in terms of that. It's as the subsecretary for that, my notes are always pretty sparse, but for your information anyhow, it will be handled in, it'll be taking place in DC on October 23rd and 24th. And that's about it. My contact information is here. If anybody has any questions, pull me aside this afternoon. If you like, or you know, just give me a holler. I'm here for you guys in any way I can be. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff.